The first reading is from Genesis. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. The word of the Lord.
So a few weeks ago, I took a trip to Florida. I drove down, and so it involved enduring many hours of Interstate 95. Many of you have driven this road also, and if so, I'm sorry. I feel your pain. It's long, it's boring, and lately it is full of what I refer to as bad billboard theology. These are billboards put up by people who seem to think that they can convert people to Christianity essentially by posting billboards that tell people that they'll go to hell if they don't get their act together. Virtually all of these billboards are perversions of Christian faith. Many clearly misunderstand the Bible quotes they're referencing. And worst of all, if you're not a Christian and wondered if just maybe there might be something to all this Jesus stuff, these signs will surely drive you away from Jesus faster than you want to drive off of 95. But as I read these signs, or at least some of them because I can't help it, it occurred to me that they often reflect popular misunderstandings of things in the Bible. For example, faith and believing are almost always portrayed on these billboards as a threat. Believe this thing, or else. And the or else part seems to mean that if you agree with the right thing and pledge allegiance to the right idea, then God will not send you to hell when you die. But if you actually read the Bible, that's not what faith and believing are all about. Faith is not saying that you believe an idea, and believing is never a response to a threat. Take Abraham, for example. In today's first reading, Abram, as he's called back then, has only recently begun to have encounters with God. And God has made a bunch of promises to Abraham. Promises that he's going to be given a land flowing with milk and honey, and that his descendants are going to be more than the stars of the sky. God makes these promises because God decides to do so. Abram has done nothing to merit them, but moreover, Abram is old. He's beyond the point where he thinks there's much of a future in front of him, and since both he and his wife are old, kids don't even seem possible anymore. And yet when God makes these promises, Abram, the text says, believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. But believing wasn't something Abram did at the end of the journey, just before he died. Instead, this is actually the beginning of the story. It's before the journey actually begins. And believing is not a response to a threat. God doesn't threaten Abraham with anything. But it's this believing that gives Abram the strength for the journey ahead, the journey of this life. In fact, believing is how Abram lives into this new relationship that he has with God. And that's really what righteousness actually means. It's about living in a right relationship with God. But because it's a relationship, it's not really about agreeing to some intellectual proposition or doctrine. Instead, Abram's believing is about taking what we might call a leap of faith. Abram actually has no idea how God is going to pull all this stuff off. God never tells him how or when. Moreover, Abram really has no track record with God. It's not like this is a God he's been serving his whole life. And Abram never says, now I have no doubts, no fears, no reservations whatsoever. And indeed, as you continue to read in Genesis, you find that Abram displays all of those things. And yet, Abram is willing to give it a shot. He's willing to take the leap of faith that God does, in fact, have a future in store for him, even though, honestly, from a practical perspective, it doesn't seem likely. And so he says, in effect, okay, God, let's see what you've got for me. And he doesn't walk away, even when the promises seem unlikely. Believing, for Abram, is also about paying attention throughout the journey. Believing is not this once and done thing where I sign a little card and say, okay, I said I believed it, and so now I go on with the rest of my life. Instead, it's an active relationship in which Abram listens for God, watches what's happening around him, and continues to ask God questions. Now, personally, when I have to go someplace, and I use this every time I go on a trip, even when I was going to Florida, I like, and I have become very addicted to Google Maps. I want to know exactly where I'm going, how to get there, and I really enjoy now that Street View feature where you can actually see what it looks like, so I know what it's going to look like when I get there. God never tells Abram any of this stuff. He doesn't tell Abram exactly where he's going, how he's going to get there, how long it will take, and only in the very broadest terms what it's going to look like. And so part of believing had to involve continually watching, listening, and questioning so that Abram could continue to figure out where and how he was going to take this long and interesting journey that God had put before him. And for Abram also, believing meant actually getting up and moving forward. Abram cannot simply sit back and say, okay, God, here I am. I'll sit back comfortably here. Lay it on me. Give me the stuff right here without me doing anything. Abram has to get up, and he has to move forward, even when he's not sure exactly what the future holds. You know, sometimes we get the impression that believing is something that, we think in our heads, or maybe we feel in our hearts. And that certainly is part of it. But Abram's story points out that believing can often only happen when we're willing to move from where we are to where God is calling us to be. So for us too, faith isn't something that gets us a reward at the end of our life's journey. Instead, as it was with Abram, faith is a relationship we have with God that gives us strength for the journey of this life. So for us too, the call of faith, the call to believe, is often about taking a leap of faith for us too. And sometimes the biggest leap of faith that we are called to take is the one like Abram took. It's the courage to trust that God actually does have a future in store for us, even when things in our lives seem bleak and getting worse. Faith is not necessary when everything seems to be going great. It's those times when things are rough, when things seem to be going downhill and not getting any better, that you really need faith. And faith is the ability to say, you know what, I'm going to trust God on this one. I'm going to trust that God does have a future in store for me. Martin Luther used to say that whenever a Christian felt like there was no hope, they should remind themselves, but I'm baptized. But I'm baptized means that God made a promise to me. I have a future and God is with me, no matter what happened yesterday, no matter what happens today. It doesn't mean that I think today will be easy or even be happy. But sometimes a leap of faith simply means, like Abram, the willingness to say, I don't know how you're going to get me through this, God, but okay, let's see what you got, and not walk away. For us too, believing is often about paying attention to the journey of this life. What are the subtle signs of God's presence and guidance that I might miss if I weren't watching for them? Who did something today that gave me a glimmer of hope? Who spoke a word to me that I really needed to hear? What did I see that caused me to think about something in a different way? Could those things be the very signs that God is using to guide and lead me to the next point in my journey of life? Faith isn't necessarily the ability to see some kind of supernatural sign, but rather the practice of growing and seeing God's hand in the routine and ordinary experiences of everyday life. and sometimes the realization that God did in fact point me in a certain way through those routine, ordinary things, gives me the courage to keep on going. And the courage to keep on going is really the point of believing. And sometimes for us too, faith is the willingness to continue to move forward. Often when we read the Bible, because of, the way that things are written down, we hear about the great transitional moments for people like Abram. The moment where God's made the promise to him, the moment where they first entered the land that he said, this is going to be the land I'm going to give you. But most days for Abram, moving forward just meant getting up, getting dressed, packing and unpacking the tent, and doing the daily stuff necessary for the day's journey. Often, that's what living faithfully looks like for us too. Even and especially when we're not sure where God is leading us, the simple willingness to get up and keep doing our regular things is often how we live into faith. Often for me, plugging along doesn't sound real exciting, but it's often a necessary process God uses to move us to a different place, whether that's a different physical place, emotional space, or spiritual place in our lives. For us, as well as for folks in the Bible, faith is about growing in a relationship with God. It's about living into the journey of this life with the constant presence and promise of God in our lives. And actually, and this is where there's a little bit of truth in the Billboard Theology, when we come to better appreciate God's promises and presence that never leave us, that also can then, in the end, give us hope for the life to come as well. But since faith is a relationship, believing is something we grow into with God's help each day. And that growth can happen whenever, through the Spirit, God gives us the courage to take a leap of faith that God does indeed have a future in store for each one of us. That growth can happen whenever, through the Spirit, God helps us to see and hear and feel the signs of God's presence and guidance in the midst of our daily journey of life. And that growth can happen whenever, through the Spirit, God gives us the strength to get up and keep moving, so that God can move us from where we are to the new and better place that God wants us to be. Amen.